democracy versus billionaires. So, at what point does extreme economic inequality stop being just a side effect of a free market and start becoming an active form of political domination? Today, we're unpacking a super urgent question. It's backed by deep historical data, economic research, and political sociology. Basically, we're asking, when does extreme wealth literally break the democratic social contract? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The threshold of domination. 2. Echoes of the Gilded Age. 3. The mechanics of capture. 4. Monopolies and digital platforms. 5. Intervening in the life cycle. And 6. Reclaiming democratic sovereignty. The threshold of domination, from economic inequality to political capture. To really wrap our heads around this shift, we need to look at political scientist Jeffrey Winters. He defines oligarchy pretty simply. He calls it the politics of wealth defense. Now, it's absolutely crucial that we view this neutrally. We aren't using this as some partisan buzzword. It's a strict academic concept. The idea is that having immense wealth just naturally skews an individual's motivations toward defending that wealth against redistribution. It makes sense, right? Winters basically divides our political reality into two distinct realms. Up top, in the horizontal realm, we see all these fierce debates over social issues. And billionaires, they're often totally divided here, funding opposing sides. It creates this highly visible, pluralistic arena that makes us feel like, hey, democracy is functioning completely normally. But that kind of obscures the vertical realm sitting right below it. Down there, when it comes to taxation and redistribution, oligarchs share a highly unified, intensely mobilized agenda to protect their assets. Echoes of the Gilded Age, historical parallels of wealth concentration. And this brilliantly illustrates the point because we can actually see this in action by looking at hard historical data. The metrics today strikingly mirror the late 19th century. Honestly, just swap out the top hats and railroads for hoodies and tech platforms. Back during the Gilded Age, the top 1% held about 45% of U.S. wealth. Today, it's hovering near 32%. Then there's the wealth Gini coefficient. That's a measure where a score of 1 means total inequality. It was 0.92 at the peak of the Gilded Age, and it is a staggering 0.85 today. But probably the most alarming part, the aggregate wealth-to-income ratio actually exceeds the 1920s right now, sitting at 500%. So how did we get back here? Well, we can see exactly how this happened by looking at the divergence of labor and capital since the mid-20th century. Back in the 1950s, union membership peaked at around 33% of the workforce. Income inequality was at historic lows, and wages were tracking right alongside productivity. But today, union density has totally collapsed, down to just 10%, while the top 1% is capturing nearly 20% of the national income. This massive historical decoupling really shows how the decline of labor's bargaining power directly increased returns to capital, basically fueling our modern second Gilded Age. The mechanics of capture, how wealth translates to power. Which brings us to a huge question. How does a private fortune actually become public policy? Well, it relies on converting wealth into structural political influence. We see this pipeline happening right out in the open through campaign finance and super PACs, especially after decisions like Citizens United completely remove spending limits. But it also operates through coordinated industry lobbying, massive media ownership that fundamentally shapes public discourse, and of course the funding of think tanks to legitimize very specific economic narratives. Now, you might be wondering, is this all just theoretical speculation? Actually, no. A landmark 2014 academic study by Gillens and Page laid this out empirically. They concluded that while the wealthy heavily influence whether federal legislation becomes law, the preferences of average Americans, they barely move the needle. The equal political voice of everyday citizens is just structurally overridden by the material power of concentrated capital. Monopolies and digital platforms, the new private governments. If oil trusts were the driving engine of the first Gilded Age, today we have big tech. As detailed in reports like A Common Platform, today's tech giants don't just participate in markets, they literally operate as the markets themselves. Companies like Amazon, Google, and major gig economy apps act as rentier monopolies. They collect immense rent, crush potential competitors, and serve as private gatekeepers to both the physical and digital economy. In a very real sense, they are the new private governments of our era. And this monopoly power, it fuels something researchers call surveillance capitalism. It's this entire economic system where our personal data is aggressively mined, and not just to sell us things, but to actively modify human behavior and consolidate corporate control. This constant data collection enables algorithmic management, which basically hardwires unfairness right into the economy, totally deepening the divide between those who own the platforms and those of us who just use them. Intervening in the life cycle, breaking the cycle of capture. So, the crucial point is, the data shows that simply patching the system downstream, like, just capping campaign finance, isn't going to cut it. Extreme wealth almost always finds a bypass. Instead, experts propose this 5-stage life cycle framework as the ultimate blueprint to prevent wealth from devolving into political domination. We have to look at the entire chain, how wealth is earned, owned, inherited, taxed, and spent. Let's break that down. In stages 1 and 2, earning and ownership, the focus is all on structural economic balance. Researchers point to a 21st century New Deal to expand collective bargaining for workers. In the digital realm, this means shifting away from enclosed platform monopolies toward multi-stakeholder ownership. It also means establishing public data trusts where communities, not just massive corporations, actually have democratic control over their own data. Moving on to stages 3 and 4, inheritance and taxation, we really have to look at political pragmatism here. For example, a massive 50% inheritance tax is historically highly unpopular. It was actually just rejected by 78% of voters in Switzerland recently, mostly because it touches on really sensitive family transfers and creates massive liquidity issues. But a 2% minimum wealth tax is an entirely different story. Data shows it's broadly popular right across partisan lines. It specifically targets top-end wealth concentration, and it creates zero liquidity issues for billionaires who have more than enough resources to pay it. Economist Gabriel Zucman hit the nail on the head here. He notes that the super rich often structure their wealth so it generates very little technically taxable income. So the solution? A broad minimum tax based on wealth itself, with virtually no exemptions. As Zucman points out, even just moving from 0 to a modest 2% is a profound change. Why? Because it brings the super rich back into the realm of national solidarity and democratic responsibility. And that brings us to the final stage, stage 5, political spending. While capping political spending and reforming campaign finance is absolutely necessary to cut that direct pipeline between private fortunes and political power, the research is crystal clear on this. This final stage only works if it's combined with the other 4 upstream wealth cycle interventions we just talked about. You have to treat the root cause, not just put a Band-Aid on the symptom. Reclaiming democratic sovereignty. So what do all these structural life cycle interventions actually aim to achieve? Well, the objective isn't just to drop some heavy-handed state regulation on everything. As illustrated by organizations like the Democracy Collaborative, the real goal is to fundamentally recode our institutions so they serve the public commons rather than just acting as giant engines for oligarchic wealth defense. Look, we absolutely cannot ignore the stakes here. When the top 1% alone captures 20% of all national income and holds an even greater share of the total wealth, that kind of concentration inevitably warps our political reality. It leads to public disillusionment, a total collapse of systemic trust, and quite frankly, a dangerous vulnerability to authoritarian politics. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Democracy is fundamentally built on the concept of equal voice. But when extreme wealth can just buy platforms, shape laws, and massively outspend majorities, that voice gets completely drowned out by unequal power. So you have to ask yourself, does our society currently operate on equal voice or equal power? And if the answer is the latter, is our democracy truly surviving the reality of modern wealth? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the data has sparked your curiosity to go out and learn more about the incredible forces shaping our world. Thank you for watching. Remember, you are worth the time it takes to slow down, listen within, and care for yourself. If you found this helpful, please subscribe for more mindful insights. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself.